Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a piece of dark history that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the grand, sweeping annals of American history, where gilded narratives of progress and prosperity are often etched in stone, certain names are intentionally forgotten. They are not erased, but rather relegated to the shadows, spoken only in hushed whispers around dying embers. Their legacies tied not to fortune, but to a darkness that defies the tidy logic of historical record. In the heart of 1850s Alabama, a time of feverish ambition and blinding sunlight, reflecting off endless fields of white cotton, the name Ellison became one such whisper. It evolved into a chilling folk tale, a cautionary legend that haunted the rolling hills and seeped into the very soil of the state. The story, passed down through generations of trembling voices, tells not of a single tragedy, but of an implacable, horrifying pattern that in the proud lineage of the Ellison family, every daughter was fated to vanish without a trace on the very day she turned 16. This was not a tragedy of war, nor of the rampant sicknesses like scarlet fever or cholera that were the common, cruel sorrows of the era. This was a methodical, supernatural reaping. It felt purposeful, like a debt being collected by an unseen creditor with the terrifying punctuality of a ticking clock. Each disappearance marking time towards the family's utter annihilation. Could a dynasty, no matter how powerful or respected, be systematically unwritten from existence by a curse tethered to the very land they had tamed and mastered? Could the earth itself, long after the plough had broken its skin and the deed of ownership was signed, rise up to claim its due in blood and bone? At the epicenter of this enduring mystery, standing as both a geographical landmark and a spiritual lightning rod, was a single, silent witness, an ancient, colossal oak tree that presided over the Ellison plantation. Its gnarled, moss-draped branches, like the supplicating arms of a forgotten god reaching for a vengeful sky, seemed to hold the secrets of the family's genesis and their ultimate, horrifying demise. It had stood there long before the Ellisons arrived, a sentinel of a forgotten age, and it would remain long after their name was little more than a ghost story. That land, the seat of the Ellisons' formidable power and the cradle of their inescapable curse, bore a name that dripped with the sweet, cloying irony of the old South Magnolia Hill. By the 1840s, the Ellison plantation was a glittering jewel of antebellum society, a sprawling domain of over 500 acres where cotton was an undisputed king. And Josiah Ellison, its master, the mansion itself was an imposing two-story monument to his success, a structure of blinding white Doric columns and dark, imported mahogany. Its grandeur was a bold, daily declaration of wealth built, as all such fortunes were, on the systematized suffering and labor of the enslaved. A wide, shaded veranda wrapped around three sides of the house, offering its master a panoramic vantage point from which to survey his kingdom, a kingdom carved from the Alabama wilderness through sheer force of will. Ornate iron gates, forged in Mobile and bearing the Ellison initial, and a long drive shaded by an archway of mature oaks, created an approach designed to inspire awe in visitors and reinforced the family's unassailable position at the apex of the social hierarchy. But beneath this meticulously crafted veneer of Southern respectability, the very foundations of Magnolia Hill were rotten. The rot was not in the timbers or the stone, but in the history of the soil itself. According to fragmented local histories and the private journals of a circuit-riding minister from that period, Josiah Ellison had acquired the core tract of his land in 1825. He was a man possessed by a singular burning ambition, a fire in his belly that saw the world as a thing to be conquered and owned. He had arrived in Alabama from Virginia with a modest inheritance and a handful of inherited slaves. And he saw in the fertile black belt soil not a complex ecosystem with a past, but a simple equation for future wealth. He brushed aside the unsettling, earnest warnings of the area's older settlers and the remaining handful of Choctaw traders. They spoke of the land being unsettled and unwelcoming to those who did not understand it, whispering that it had once been a sacred burial ground for an obscure matriarchal religious sect that had mysteriously disappeared from the region in the late 1700s after a violent confrontation with outsiders. To a man of uncompromising logic and commerce like Josiah, these were merely the superstitions of the uneducated and the defeated, inconvenient myths that were obstacles to progress. In his mind, ownership was absolute. A signed deed and a strong fence were all that mattered. With a chilling lack of ceremony, he had the grounds plowed. The ancient, carved stones marking the gravesites either shattered or buried, and on that desecrated soil, he erected his empire, never once imagining the price his own bloodline would be forced to pay. While the white society of Alabama saw only the Ellisons' magnificent house and celebrated their legendary generosity, the enslaved people who lived and toiled on the land knew a deeper, more frightening truth. They felt it in the oppressive humidity that seemed to cling heavier there, in the unnatural silence that often fell over the fields at midday, in their whispered conversations. Late at night, in the relative safety of their quarters, they shared stories. They spoke of the land's memory, of a sorrow that clung to the roots of the cotton plants. They warned their children away from the ancient oak, where they claimed the air grew cold even on the hottest summer day, and where flowers planted in its shadow grew in disturbing, vibrant hues, yet gave off a sickly sweet scent that brought on headaches and terrifying dreams. They understood, in a way their master never could, that Magnolia Hill was not merely a place, it was an entity with its own consciousness, and it was watching, waiting, and at the heart of this gilded, haunted cage, presiding over its secrets, both known and terrifyingly unknown, were the Ellisons themselves, Josiah and his wife, Elizabeth. In the eyes of Alabama society, Josiah was the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made man who commanded respect. He had arrived with little, and through a combination of shrewd business acumen and relentless work ethic that saw him laboring alongside his first slaves in the early years, had become one of the region's most prosperous planters. He was a man of the physical, tangible world, a master of cotton trades and land deals, a respected vestryman at St. James Episcopal Church. His worldview was built on order, control, and a supreme confidence in his own judgment, leaving no room for the phantoms of folklore. This rigid rationalism, the very quality that had forged his fortune, would become his fatal flaw, a willful blindness, an arrogant refusal to acknowledge the encroaching darkness that could not be quantified in a ledger or outmaneuvered in a negotiation. His wife, Elizabeth Montgomery Ellison, was his perfect counterpart, or so it appeared to the outside world. A woman of delicate, ethereal beauty and quiet determination, 20 years his junior. She was the epitome of the Southern belle. She managed the grand household with an efficiency that belied her fragile appearance, hosted seasonal balls that were the talk of 3 counties, and taught Sunday school with a gentle, unwavering piety that charmed the community. Yet, behind the serene, carefully constructed facade of the plantation mistress was a woman wrestling with a profound and terrifying knowledge. Her most constant companion was not her husband or her 5 children, but a heavy ornate silver hand mirror, a Montgomery family heirloom from a time when her ancestors were still in the Virginia colony. The house slaves, particularly her personal maid, Bessie, would watch with a mixture of fear and fascination as Elizabeth would pause in her daily activities to gaze into its reflective surface. Her expression would shift from placid to one of intense, silent communion, her amber eyes fixed, her lips sometimes moving without sound. It was as if she were not merely observing her reflection, but scrying for answers in its polished depths, pleading with a presence that stared back from a world just beyond the silvered glass. This was not her only deviation from the script of a lady of her station. There were the solitary, moonlit walks, pilgrimages, almost that always led her to the edge of the formal gardens, to the looming silhouette of the ancient oak, Bessie, who had served Elizabeth since her marriage, would later recount seeing her mistress standing beneath its massive, twisted branches, her pale nightgown a ghostly shape in the darkness. She would speak in a low voice, using words in a language Bessie had never heard, not French, not Latin, but something older, more guttural. Her voice would not carry on the wind, but seemed to be absorbed by the rough bark of the tree itself. A secret offering to a thirsty god. These were the first tremors of the earthquake to come, the subtle but persistent signs of an abnormal reality festering just beneath the surface of their perfect, ordered lives. Elizabeth was not an unwitting victim of circumstance. She was a keeper of a terrible secret, engaged in a desperate, one-sided negotiation with a power she understood far better than her husband. She was performing her own rituals, a frantic counter-magic against the land's ancient claim, a battle she was destined to lose. The chilling contrast between their public piety and private terror was the true, unstable foundation upon which the house of Ellison was built. The fragile veneer of Southern decorum at Magnolia Hill, already stretched thin by a host of unspoken anxieties, finally began to fracture in the summer of 1845. The catalyst was not a war nor a financial collapse, but something as natural and relentlessly anticipated as a change in seasons, the impending 16th birthday of the eldest daughter. Margaret, in the rigid social theatre of the antebellum South. A young lady's 16th year was a milestone of profound, almost sacred, significance. It marked a formal, irreversible transition from the cloistered world of childhood to the strategic battlefield of womanhood, where she would be presented to society and begin the critical process of securing a suitable husband. For the daughter of a planter as wealthy and influential as Josiah Ellison, this was not merely a celebration, it was a dynastic maneuver, a public spectacle designed to be marked by a lavish coming-out ball and the commissioning of a portrait to immortalize her entry into the marriage market. Margaret Ellison, however, was not a typical daughter of the planter class, bred for polite conversation and domestic management. She possessed her father's fiercely determined gray eyes and a spirited, probing intellect that often concerned her mother. While other girls her age were content with needlepoint and the gentle, predictable melodies of the pianoforte, Margaret had a voracious appetite for knowledge that was considered highly improper, even dangerous. For a young woman of her station, she devoured books from her father's library histories, philosophical treatises by men like Voltaire, even medical texts that made her governess. A pragmatic spinster from Boston named Miss Abigail Potter. Blush, Miss Potter, a woman of sharp intellect herself, recognized Margaret's unusual brilliance and secretly encouraged it. Much to Elizabeth's dismay, she will never find a husband if she insists on discussing radical philosophy at the dinner table, Elizabeth had lamented to Josiah more than once. But Josiah, for all his conventional ambitions, took a certain defiant pride in his daughter's sharp mind. "I'd rather have a daughter with thoughts in her head than one who can only simper and pour tea," he would retort, ending the discussion with an air of finality. But in the weeks leading up to her July birthday, a disquieting change descended upon the spirited young woman. Her intellectual fire seemed to dim, replaced by a withdrawn, haunted quality that settled over her like a shroud. She spent long, silent hours alone in her bedroom or walking in the gardens, her path invariably leading her toward the oppressive shadow of the great oak tree. This transformation was noted by everyone, from her younger siblings to the house slaves who observed the family's rhythms with an acuity born of necessity. It was Miss Porter, however, who became the sole confidant to the true nature of Margaret's spiraling distress. The governess's private journal, a leather-bound volume discovered decades later, provides the only surviving testament to the terror that was unfolding within the walls of that grand house. The ink is faded now, a ghostly brown against the yellowed paper, but the words remain starkly, terrifyingly legible. On June 12, 1845, Miss Porter wrote, "Margaret confided in me today about her dreams. She speaks of a woman with hollow eyes who calls to her by name, appearing to her nightly, always standing beneath the old oak at the eastern boundary of the property. Margaret describes her as wearing a white dress of a fashion from another era, her hair loose about her shoulders in a manner no respectable woman would wear. The figure never speaks aloud, yet Margaret insists she can hear her voice clearly in her mind, a persistent, silvery whisper that calls her daughter and promises to bring her home." I attempted to reassure her, suggesting it was merely the result of reading too many Gothic novels before bedtime. But there is a haunted quality to the girl's gaze, a profound certainty that troubles me to my very soul. A week later, the journal entries grew more frantic, the handwriting more slanted. Margaret's dreams have worsened. She now speaks of multiple women, all in white, all with the same hollow-eyed gaze, standing in a semicircle behind the first. They sing to her, she says, a melody without words that stays with her long after waking, a low humming that she sometimes thinks she can hear even in the daylight hours. She hummed it for me today. It was a strange, atonal sequence that seemed to slide between the notes of a conventional scale, a profoundly unsettling sound that felt less like music and more like the embodiment of an ancient, inconsolable grief. The weight of this shared secret began to crush the Boston-bred governess. Accustomed to a world governed by reason and a stern Congregationalist faith, she found herself an unwilling audience to a drama that felt primal, pagan, and terrifyingly real. She resolved to approach the master of the house, convinced that Josiah Ellison's famous pragmatism would lead him to seek medical or clerical counsel for his distressed daughter. She found him in his study, a room that was the very heart of his rational world, surrounded by maps of his ever-expanding land holdings, ledgers detailing his cotton yields, and books on scientific agriculture. As she carefully, logically recounted Margaret's unsettling visions and the strange, obsessive melody, she watched as Josiah's expression hardened, not with fatherly concern, but with a cold, rising impatience. "Miss Porter," he interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "I employ you to educate my daughter in the feminine arts and languages, not to indulge and interpret her girlish nightmares. She is a girl of 16, on the cusp of womanhood. Her imagination is naturally overwrought." He stood and walked to the window, staring out at his domain as if the sight of his orderly, sun-drenched fields could negate the shadowy chaos she described. "Perhaps she requires less time with her books and more fresh air. Focus your lessons on practical matters, household management. That is what will serve her best in life." When Miss Porter, her own voice trembling with urgency, tried to impress upon him the sheer depth of Margaret's terror, he cut her off decisively. "I will not have this superstitious nonsense spoken of in my house. It ends now." The dismissal was absolute, a stone wall of patriarchal authority against which her reasonable concerns could only shatter. Defeated, Miss Porter retreated, her sense of dread now mingled with a new fear, not of the supernatural, but of the willful, arrogant blindness of the man in charge. Her feelings of isolation deepened profoundly when she next broached the subject with Margaret, suggesting that perhaps she should speak with her mother, that a woman's comfort might soothe her troubled mind. Margaret, who had been listlessly tracing the patterns of condensation on a windowpane, turned to face her governess. The look in her eyes was no longer that of a frightened girl, but of someone who had passed through terror into a state of cold, grim resignation. "You don't understand, Miss Porter," she said, her voice so low and devoid of emotion that it scarcely sounded like her own. "Mother doesn't need me to tell her." She paused, her gaze flicking towards the window, towards the distant, dark shape of the oak. "She's always known they would come for me." The statement, delivered with such chilling finality, hung in the air between them, more terrifying than any phantom. It instantly recontextualized everything Miss Porter had witnessed Elizabeth's long, silent gazes into her silver mirror, her solitary, purposeful walks, her carefully maintained but brittle composure. She was not an oblivious parent. She was a knowing participant, a woman standing a silent, lonely watch over a doom that she felt powerless to prevent. The house, once merely a place of prestigious employment for Miss Porter, now felt like a prison, each inhabitant playing a prescribed role in a tragedy whose script had been written in the very soil long ago. The pressure was no longer just on Margaret. It was a palpable entity, a suffocating presence that permeated the very air of Magnolia Hill, tightening its invisible grip as the 15th of July drew inexorably, unstoppably closer. The morning of Margaret's 16th birthday dawned with a cruel, breathtaking beauty. The Alabama sky was a vast, cloudless expanse of brilliant cerulean blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the magnolia trees, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of jasmine from the gardens. The entire plantation was a flurry of purposeful activity, a perfectly orchestrated symphony of preparation for what was to be the social event of the season. From her window, Elizabeth Ellison oversaw the proceedings, her instructions delivered with a calm, icy precision that betrayed none of the frantic terror that was churning within her soul. In the kitchens, Ruth, the head cook who had been with Josiah since his first days in Alabama, supervised the creation of a feast fit for royalty: roast duck with orange glaze, sweet potato souffle, and a magnificent three-tiered cake adorned with crystallized violets that had taken her assistants 2 full days to perfect. In the grand ballroom, house slaves carefully polished the immense crystal chandeliers and fitted them with fresh beeswax candles. Garlands of fresh-cut roses and magnolias were draped along the spiraling central staircase and wound around the stately columns of the front portico. The pianoforte had been tuned, and a string quartet from Mobile was expected to arrive by mid-afternoon. The younger daughters, Catherine and Josephine, giddy with excitement, practiced their dance steps in their new silk dresses of pale pink and lavender. The entire scene was a portrait of idyllic southern prosperity, a vibrant, sun-drenched tableau of life and celebration. It was a beautiful, meticulously constructed lie. Margaret herself spent the morning in her room, a picture of unnatural composure. She wore a simple morning dress of pale blue muslin and sat at her writing desk, composing letters to friends. Her lady's maid, a young slave named Delia, later reported that Margaret had seemed distant, almost serene, her movements fluid and calm, as if she had finally made peace with an inevitable and terrible appointment. At midday, as the July sun reached its zenith, pressing down upon the plantation with a physical, suffocating weight, Margaret made a simple request. She wished to take a moment of solitude, to walk in the gardens before the chaos of the guests' arrival began. Elizabeth, distracted by a minor crisis involving the seating arrangements, agreed without much thought, though she instructed her own maid, Bessie, to follow at a discreet distance. "The sun is fierce," Elizabeth cautioned, her voice tight. "Ensure she does not spoil her complexion." Bessie watched as Margaret, a cool splash of pale blue against the fiery reds and yellows of the summer blooms, moved through the formal gardens. Her stride was not the leisurely pace of a young lady admiring flowers. It was purposeful, direct. She trailed her fingers in the cool water of the central fountain for a moment before continuing, her path taking her beyond the manicured rosebeds toward the wilder edge of the property, toward the ancient waiting oak. Bessie was about to call out, to remind her of the time, when a brief, mundane distraction caught her eye. One of the prized Dominique chickens had somehow escaped its coop and was pecking near the garden shed. Knowing the cook's temper, Bessie turned to chase it back. The task of herding the errand bird took only a few moments. But when Bessie turned back, a scant few moments later, her heart seized in her chest. The meadow was empty. It was not simply that Margaret was out of sight. The entire space felt hollow, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean of her presence. Margaret Ellison had been erased from the landscape. At first, there was no alarm, only maternal exasperation. When a breathless, wide-eyed Bessie reported what had happened, Elizabeth merely sighed, assuming it was a last, willful prank. She dispatched servants to check the spring house and the stables. But as the minutes bled into an hour, and the first carriages of esteemed guests began to appear on the long oak-lined drive, concern curdled into a quiet, sickening panic. Josiah, his initial irritation at his daughter's willfulness hardening into a dark, primal fear, organized the male servants and slaves into search parties. He was forced to make the humiliating decision to inform the assembled guests that Margaret had been taken suddenly and violently ill, and the celebration was indefinitely postponed. As the last of the disappointed guests departed into the twilight, the search began in earnest, expanding into the surrounding fields and woods. Lanterns flickered through the night like captured, desperate stars. Men called Margaret's name until their throats were raw, and bloodhounds, brought in from a neighboring plantation, circled the spot where she was last seen, whining in utter confusion, unable to establish a single trail leading away from the meadow. Just as the first gray, hopeless hint of dawn threatened to break on the horizon, a discovery was made. Samuel, the son of Ruth and Moses, had continued searching long after others had collapsed from exhaustion. At the base of the great oak tree, the very one from Margaret's nightmares, lay a single, impossible object. It was a white satin slipper with a delicate pearl button, one of the pair commissioned for the night's celebration. When Josiah was summoned, he stumbled through the woods and fell to his knees beside it, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The slipper was pristine, its white fabric unstained by the dew-dampened ground on which it sat. But the most impossible, terrifying detail was revealed when Josiah finally reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. Despite having lain on the cool, wet grass for hours, the slipper was completely, inexplicably dry, and it was warm. It was unnaturally, impossibly warm, as if it had just been removed from a living foot. The ground around the tree was undisturbed. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle. There was only the solitary, warm slipper, a silent, damning testament to an event that defied all logic. A chilling declaration that Margaret Ellison had not run away, nor been taken. She had simply vanished. The 2 years that followed Margaret's vanishing were a slow, agonizing descent into a new, suffocating reality for the Ellison family. The initial, frantic energy of the search, fueled by Josiah's immense wealth and desperate, defiant hope, gradually gave way to the dull, persistent ache of an unsolved mystery. He spared no expense, hiring private investigators from as far as Mobile and Montgomery, and posting substantial rewards for any information in newspapers across the South. But every lead dissolved into rumor. Every rumored sighting proved cruelly false. The once proud patriarch, a man whose ambition had seemed capable of bending the very world to his will, now moved through his own magnificent home like a ghost, haunted by the phantom of his firstborn. The opulent silence in Magnolia Hill became a living entity, heavy and oppressive, swallowing the memory of the laughter and music that had once filled its halls. Elizabeth, his wife, retreated into a fragile porcelain world of her own. Often confined to her bed with mysterious ailments the family physician could neither diagnose nor treat, a place was still set for Margaret at the dinner table each night, a nightly ritual of magical thinking performed against a grief too profound to fully accept. Life, however, has a cruel and inexorable momentum. It does not pause for sorrow. As the summer of 1847 approached, a new, specific, and infinitely more terrifying dread began to coil in the pit of every stomach. Catherine, the family's practical second daughter, was nearing her 16th birthday. If Margaret had been the family's dreamer, Catherine was its pragmatist. She possessed her mother's fair hair, but her father's steady, no-nonsense gaze. In the wake of her sister's disappearance, she had matured with astonishing speed, taking on many of the domestic duties her grieving mother had abandoned. She did not speak of dreams or phantoms. "I have no time for nightmares," she stated plainly to Miss Porter, who had remained with the family, her role shifting from governess to a kind of warden for the remaining children. Margaret's disappearance was a terrible tragedy, Catherine would insist, her voice laced with a conviction that seemed almost desperate. But it was the work of men, of kidnappers or villains. It will not happen to me. Father has taken precautions. Josiah had indeed taken precautions, but they were the precautions of a man attempting to fight a hurricane with fortress walls. His grief had transmuted into a manic, obsessive need for absolute control. Magnolia Hill was no longer a home. It was a stronghold. He hired armed men, grim-faced and watchful, to patrol the boundaries day and night. but his greatest act of defiance was aimed at the silent, wooden witness to his first loss. In the spring of 1847, he ordered the great oak tree to be cut down. The older slaves watched in horror, whispering among themselves that to harm the tree was to invite a swifter, more terrible retribution. It took 3 men a full day, their axes seeming to strike a wood far harder and more resilient than natural oak. The tree was dismembered, its massive trunk and limbs chopped and burned in a great, smoldering pyre that choked the air for a week with a foul, resinous smoke. Josiah believed he had cut out the very heart of the curse. As Catherine's birthday on October the 3rd drew near, the house was placed on complete lockdown. She was never left alone. A nervous cousin, Harriet, slept in her room at night, and she was accompanied by Miss Porter, or her mother, everywhere she went during the day. On the morning of her birthday, the atmosphere in the house was thick with an unbreathable tension. Elizabeth had taken to her bed entirely, sedated with laudanum, unable to face the anniversary of her failure. Josiah paced the halls like a caged animal, his eyes darting towards every window, checking and rechecking the guards at their posts. Catherine herself remained composed, though Miss Porter noted in her journal a certain rigid resignation in the girl's posture, as if she were steeling herself for an inevitability she dared not name. The day passed without incident. Catherine received her gifts, shared a small, tense meal with her family, and retired early, visibly exhausted by the weight of their collective dread. It was just before dawn when the screams began. The cousin, Harriet, awoke with a start to a room that felt unnaturally cold, the flame in the oil lamp guttering wildly. Catherine's bed was empty. She raised the alarm, and within minutes, the household was thrown into a maelstrom of chaos and raw disbelief. The scene in that room was more terrifying than any sign of violence or struggle. Catherine's white nightgown was found laid out perfectly, neatly, on her bed, as if she had simply evaporated out of it. The bedroom window was not only closed, but latched firmly from the inside. The heavy wooden door had been locked from within, and the key was still sitting in the keyhole. On the inside of the room, there was no secret passage, no loose floorboard, no conceivable point of egress. It was an impossible, hermetically sealed puzzle. The bloodhounds, brought to the locked door, picked up no scent trail leading away. They simply sat on their haunches, whining pitifully, their instincts utterly baffled. The second, impossible vanishing did not just break something within Josiah Ellison. It pulverized the very foundations of his reality. All his life, he had battled tangible foes, rival planters, unpredictable markets, the stubbornness of the soil itself. But this was irrefutable evidence that he was at war, not with men or misfortune, but with the very laws of nature. The pattern was confirmed. The curse was real, and it was laughing at his walls. The 2 years that followed Catherine's impossible disappearance transformed Magnolia Hill from a fortress into a tomb. The once prosperous plantation began its final, swift decline. Josiah, now a hollow-eyed, gaunt spectre of his former self, neglected the fields entirely. His obsession shifted from defiance to containment with his own hands. He installed heavy iron bars on all the windows of the great house, not to keep intruders out, but to keep his 2 remaining daughters in. He dismissed most of the house servants, his eyes wild with a paranoia that trusted no one. The family was now sealed within the gilded cage he had built, imprisoned by his all-consuming fear. And as time moved forward, inexorable and cruel, it brought the 16th birthday of the 3rd daughter, Josephine, ever closer. Having been 12 when Margaret vanished and 14 when Catherine followed, Josephine had grown into a solemn young woman who rarely smiled and never ventured beyond the suffocating, shadowed confines of the house. Unlike her sisters, one who was haunted. The other defiant Josephine seemed to anticipate her fate with a kind of grim, sorrowful, and terrifying resignation. She had become the family's unwilling oracle, the one who saw the truth most clearly, because she had never known a life without the curse's constant, looming shadow. In the winter of 1849, just months before her birthday, she sought out Miss Porter in the dead of night, a small candle casting a flickering, trembling light on her pale face. The governess recorded the conversation, her handwriting a barely controlled scroll. Josephine came to my room tonight. Her composure was the most dreadful thing I have ever witnessed. She asked if I would do her a service. She pleaded with me to take Sarah away before April comes. "They won't stop with me," she said, her voice a monotone whisper that held no trace of fear, only fact. "They'll take Sarah, too, when her time comes. But you can save her. Miss Porter, take her north to your people. Change her name. Never speak of the Ellisons again." When I, trembling, asked her who they were, she looked at me with a profound, pitying expression, as if I were a simpleton who could not see the sun in the sky. "The women in white, of course," she said. "The ones who were here before us. The ones whose sleep we disturbed." I promised I would try, though in my heart I know Mr. Ellison would sooner see the world burn than let his youngest child out of his sight. This was not a premonition. It was a statement of fact from an eyewitness to an unseen world. Josephine's confession laid bare the nature of the entity haunting them. It was not a random evil, but a primordial force with a purpose, a claim to be settled. In a final, desperate paroxysm of lucidity, Elizabeth pleaded with her broken husband to flee. "We must leave this place," she proposed one night at a silent, untouched dinner table, her voice thin and reedy. "We will go north. We will change our names, start anew where this shadow cannot follow us." For the first time, Josiah, utterly defeated, his rational world in ruins, agreed. The decision was made. They would leave at first light, abandoning the house, the land, the fortune, everything to save what little remained of their family. The night of April 22nd, 1849, the eve of Josephine's 16th birthday, was spent in a frantic, whispered haste. Trunks were packed, valuables were secured. Little Sarah, now 5, was told they were going on a grand adventure and clapped her hands in delight, her innocence a heart-breaking counterpoint to her family's utter desperation. Josephine was calm, almost serene, as she helped her mother pack. A strange, otherworldly peace settled upon her as the first hint of grey light appeared on the horizon. The family gathered in the cavernous entrance hall, ready to flee the prison that had once been their palace. Josiah did a final head count. Elizabeth, Josephine, Sarah, Miss Porter, all were present. "Where is Thomas?" he asked suddenly, his voice tight with a new, immediate wave of panic. His son and heir, now 21, had been tasked with readying the horses and carriage. He should have returned. Josiah opened the massive front door, the only one not boarded up, and stepped onto the porch, calling his son's name into the pre-dawn gloom. There was no answer. "Stay here," Josiah commanded the women, his voice cracking. "Bar the door behind me. I will find him." As Josiah disappeared into the mist toward the stables, the women huddled in the entrance hall, listening to the crushing silence. It was then that Josephine's strange peace became terrifyingly clear. "He's not coming for me," she whispered, her voice eerily calm. "They are. Before anyone could react, she walked to the front door, lifted the heavy iron bar, and stepped outside onto the porch. Miss Porter lunged, catching her by the wrist, but Josephine turned to her with a look of such profound peace and certainty that the governess's grip faltered. "It's all right," Josephine said, her voice soft as a sigh. "This is how it must be. Look after Sarah. Remember your promise." She pulled her arm free and walked down the porch steps, her simple white dress a bright, spectral shape in the gathering morning sun. Elizabeth screamed, a raw animal sound of pure loss, and rushed to the doorway. But she stopped at the threshold as if hitting an invisible, unyielding wall, beating against it with her fists as she wailed her daughter's name. Miss Porter, feeling no such resistance, made to follow, but froze in horror at what she saw. Across the overgrown lawn, standing in a silent semicircle where the great oak's charred stump lay, were 7 women, cloaked in white, their forms indistinct, wavering like heat shimmer on a summer road. Among them, Miss Porter would later swear under oath, she could discern the serene, familiar faces of Margaret and Catherine. They extended their hands not in menace, but in welcome. Josephine walked towards them without hesitation. As she reached them, she knelt before the blackened stump. From its dead wood, impossibly, a slender green sapling was rising, bathed in an ethereal light. Josephine placed her hands upon the fresh, vibrant shoots, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, all 8 figures, the 7 in white and Josephine, were gone. The lawn was empty, save for the sapling, which now stood as a young, impossible tree, its leaves unfurling in seconds, reaching for the sky. Of Josiah and Thomas Ellison, who had gone out into the mist. No trace was ever found. The curse had been paid in full. The Ellison family, for all its wealth and power, had been undone. Its legacy now nothing more than a ruined plantation and a terrifying story whispered on the unforgiving Alabama wind. With the dawn of April 23rd, 1849, the story of the Ellison family of Magnolia Hill effectively ended, and a grim, terrible legend began. The flight of the 3 survivors was not an escape, but a shattered retreat from a battlefield where they had been utterly vanquished. Elizabeth Ellison, her mind finally and irrevocably broken by the sight of her last daughter being consumed by an otherworldly force, became as placid and unresponsive as a porcelain doll. The fire of her secret knowledge and desperate grief had been extinguished, leaving only a cold, empty shell. It fell to the steadfast governess, Miss Abigail Porter, to fulfill her final, solemn promise, driven by a grim sense of duty and a terror that would shadow her for the rest of her days. She guided Elizabeth and a confused, weeping little Sarah away from the ruins of their lives, taking only what they could carry in a single carriage, leaving the grand mansion and its ghosts to the mercy of the encroaching wilderness. They fled north to Virginia, to the cold, judgmental comfort of Elizabeth's Montgomery relatives. There, a final, desperate act of redefinition took place. The name Ellison, now synonymous with madness, tragedy, and an unspeakable curse, was systematically buried. Sarah Ellison ceased to exist. In her place, Sarah Montgomery was born, raised by her maternal grandparents as if she were their own late-born child, meticulously shielded from the horrifying truth of her lineage. Elizabeth lived for 6 more years, a silent, beautiful wraith who rarely spoke, often seen staring at her own reflection in any polished surface, perhaps searching for the faces of those she had lost. She passed away in her sleep in 1855, her death officially recorded as resulting from a nervous affliction. Miss Porter remained, a stern but loving warden to Sarah's innocence, until the girl was grown. Before her own death, The governess compiled her journals and all the fragmented accounts of the tragedy she had witnessed, sealing them in a cedar box with strict instructions that they not be opened until a full half-century had passed. She had recorded the truth, but she prayed the world would be allowed to forget. For decades, the story survived only as a whispered local folktale, a ghost story to frighten children away from the overgrown, ruined grounds of the old plantation. But history, like the land, has a memory and a patience all its own. In the 1890s, a young, ambitious historian at the University of Alabama named Dr. William Harcourt became fascinated by the persistent local legend and began researching the case. Digging through dusty newspaper archives and court records, his research led him to the story of an older presence on the land, an obscure matriarchal sect from the late 1700s. In 1899, he published a small controversial paper suggesting the Ellison events were tied to this older history. His theories were dismissed by his colleagues as fanciful nonsense. A year later, in the summer of 1900, Harcourt made one final visit to the site. He was never seen again. Then, in 1902, in a moment of profound historical irony, Miss Porter's sealed cedar box was discovered during renovations in Virginia. Her journals, filled with chilling, first-hand details, provided a horrifying corroboration of Dr. Harcourt's fanciful theories, transforming him from a disgraced academic into another tragic victim of the Ellison legacy. The story, now armed with eyewitness testimony, took on a life of its own, a tapestry woven from historical fact, supernatural belief, and the chilling repeating pattern of disappearance. The land itself was eventually divided and sold after the Civil War. The great house was torn down. Only the oak tree, the impossible sapling that had sprouted from the stump, was left standing. It grew at an unnatural rate, and today stands as a protected landmark, a living paradox that defies scientific explanation. Its size suggests an age of 500 years. Yet, historical records prove it can be no older than the date of Josephine's vanishing. It is a monument to a power that operates outside the known laws of nature. And the legend did not die. In 1965, a brazen developer named Howard Daniels, seeking to debunk the superstitious nonsense before building a new subdivision, staged a live radio broadcast from beneath the tree on the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance. The recording is infamous. As midnight struck, Daniels' confident tone dissolved into whispered awe. "They're here." His voice crackled over the airwaves, just before a sound like a sigh, and then only static. "My God, they're beautiful." He was never found. What, then, is the final meaning of this dark and persistent tragedy? Is it merely a cautionary tale about the arrogance of men like Josiah Ellison, who believe they can own the earth and erase its past? Or is it something more profound? The story of Magnolia Hill forces us to ask unsettling questions about our relationship with the places we inhabit. Does a place hold a memory of trauma? Can a profound violation of what is sacred create a wound in time, an echo that continues to demand payment? Generation after generation, the line between history and myth, between madness and the supernatural, blurs and ultimately dissolves in the face of the Ellison family's fate. We are left with a chilling conclusion that some truths are not meant to be uncovered by the living, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Perhaps the most terrifying part of this legacy is the quiet implication that it is not yet over. The women in white, whether they are spirits, guardians, or something else entirely, are patient. They have waited through wars, through the rise and fall of nations, through the advent of electricity and the age of information. They are still waiting. So if you ever find yourself on a quiet road in southern Alabama, and a strange curiosity draws you toward a lone, impossibly ancient oak tree standing sentinel over a silent field, remember the Ellison daughters. Remember Dr. Harcourt. Remember Howard Daniels. Remember all those who sought answers and instead became part of the enduring, terrible question. Listen for a humming on the edge of hearing. Watch for movement in the corner of your eye. And ask yourself, with all sincerity, are you certain you know who is calling you home?